4,600 yards. That was the final number etched into the glass. There was nothing beyond it. On December 1st, 1944, near the German frontier at Beek, Lieutenant Alfred Rose sat exposed in the open turret of his tank destroyer, still learning the controls of a vehicle he had barely mastered. Then something shifted along the ridge to the northeast. A Panther. Rose steadied the telescopic sight and dialed the range outward. The numbers climbed until they stopped at 4,600 yards, the absolute limit of the optic. Beyond that point, there was no calibration, no data, no guarantee. He fired anyway. This is the story of the M36 Gun Motor Carriage, the open-topped, thin-skinned tank destroyer that became America's only reliable answer to the Panther and the Tiger, a weapon so urgently required that the Army mounted it on 3 entirely different hulls just to get it to the front. A vehicle whose most obvious flaw, the absence of a roof, was a deliberate engineering decision, and a machine so effective that it ultimately rendered obsolete the very tank destroyer branch that created it. To understand why the M36 had to exist, you have to understand the crisis that nearly shattered American armored forces in 1944. By the summer of that year, U.S. tank destroyer units fielded 2 primary vehicles, the M10 Wolverine and the M18 Hellcat. Both carried guns that, on paper, appeared sufficient. In reality, neither could reliably destroy a Panther from the front. The M10's 3-inch gun and the M18's 76mm gun fired projectiles at nearly identical velocities. At 500 yards, both achieved approximately 88 to 93 millimeters of penetration. A Panther's glacis plate was 80 millimeters thick, but angled at 55 degrees. That slope translated into an effective thickness exceeding 139 millimeters. The math did not work. American shells struck that sloped armor and deflected harmlessly, skipping away like stones across water. In August 1944, the 12th Army Group ordered live-fire trials at Signy, France, against captured Panther hulks. Crews tested every American anti-tank round available in inventory. The results were devastating. The 3-inch armor-piercing round could not penetrate the Panther's frontal glacis at 200 yards. 200 yards, close enough to see the enemy crew through open hatches. The findings reached General Dwight D. Eisenhower. His response became infamous. "Ordnance told me this 76 would take care of anything the Germans had. Now I find you can't knock out a damn thing with it." The consequences in the field were counted in casualties. On July 10, 1944, near Le Désert, the 899th Tank Destroyer Battalion destroyed 12 Panthers at ranges under 200 meters, point blank by armored standards. Those crews were not dying for lack of courage. They were dying because their weapons lacked reach. The M10 and M18 could kill a Panther, but only from the flank, and only at distances so close that a single mistake meant annihilation. In those engagements, the first round to hit decided everything. What American forces needed was a mobile platform capable of defeating heavy German armor from the front, at range, before the exchange turned into a death sentence. That gun already existed. The 90mm M3, the most powerful anti-tank weapon the United States could mount on a mobile chassis, offered 30 to 40% greater penetration than any other gun in the American arsenal. It had been available since 1942. For 2 years, procurement officials debated whether troops truly required it. By the time the first M36 reached France in October 1944, the men it was meant to protect had already spent 4 months fighting Panthers with weapons that could not reliably penetrate them. The heart of the M36 was not the vehicle itself, it was the gun. The 90mm M3 descended directly from America's primary heavy anti-aircraft weapon, the 90mm M1. In precisely the same way Germany's famed 88mm began its life firing at bombers before being turned against tanks. That anti-aircraft lineage gave the weapon 2 defining traits: a flat trajectory and exceptional muzzle velocity. The standard M82 armor-piercing round left the barrel at 2,800 feet per second and penetrated 129 millimeters of steel at 500 yards. For the first time in the war against Germany's heavy armor, the numbers began to favor the Americans. That performance changed the geometry of the battlefield. It meant a Panther's turret mantlet could be penetrated at 1,000 yards. A Tiger I's flat frontal hull could be defeated at roughly the same distance. And for the rare crews who received the scarce tungsten core high-velocity armor-piercing round, though most never did, penetration leapt to 221 millimeters. That was enough to punch through even a King Tiger's turret at 800 yards. For the first time, American crews could kill German heavy armor without closing to suicidal distance. The 90mm gun sat inside an open-topped turret mounted on a repurposed M10 hull. The vehicle weighed 29 tons, powered by a 450-horsepower Ford V8 engine. A crew of 5 operated it. And there was no roof. That absence was not oversight. It was doctrine-made steel. 5 interlocking reasons produced that open top, each revealing the philosophy behind the machine. First, weight. The 90mm breech was massive. Its ammunition was large, heavy, and demanded interior volume. A roof would have added weight and restricted working space in an already crowded turret. Second, counterbalance. Rather than stuffing the turret bustle with dead weight, crude cast iron blocks as used in the M10, engineers stored 11 ready rounds of 90mm ammunition inside it. Functional mass instead of ballast. Efficient, elegant, until a single penetrating hit into the turret rear ignited the ready rack. Third, visibility. The commander had unobstructed 360-degree observation. Tank destroyer doctrine insisted these vehicles should never be the first seen. Situational awareness was survival. Fourth, cost. Lieutenant General Leslie McNair had been blunt. It is poor economy to use a $35,000 medium tank to destroy another tank when the job can be done by a gun costing a fraction as much. Tank destroyers were meant to be economical anti-armor specialists, not armored duelists. Fifth, doctrine itself. The entire tank destroyer concept assumed these vehicles would never absorb a direct hit. If the enemy was firing at you, something had already gone wrong. The open turret was that assumption made physical. Protection was sacrificed for mobility, firepower, and field of view. The man who commanded the Tank Destroyer Center at Camp Hood, Texas, Major General Andrew Bruce, championed these principles, and he opposed the M36. Bruce favored the lightweight M18 Hellcat. His philosophy was simple and internally consistent. Speed over firepower, a cruiser, not a battleship. Strike first, relocate fast, avoid being hit at all costs. To him, the M36 was too heavy, too slow. A deviation from the doctrine he had helped shape. He was overruled by the Ordnance Department. The weapon he resisted would become the most effective American tank destroyer of the war. The vehicle he championed saw its 76mm gun rendered inadequate by the very Panthers it was meant to destroy. Even after approval, the M36 nearly died twice in bureaucratic crossfire. Army ground forces initially resisted full production. The 90mm gun was already allocated to the T-26 Pershing, a heavy tank that would not fire its first combat shot until February 1945. Then, in the spring of 1944, just weeks before the Normandy invasion, U.S. forces in Europe were offered M36s to replace their M10s. They declined. That single decision cost months. When Panthers appeared in strength in Normandy, the only American mobile weapon capable of reliably killing them from the front was sitting in depots in the United States. Production finally began at the Fisher Tank Arsenal in Grand Blanc, Michigan, in April 1944. Urgency forced improvisation. When stocks of M10 hulls ran short, engineers mounted M36 turrets onto M4 Sherman hulls, creating the M36B1. The transition from concept to combat occurred in weeks. A third variant retained the original M10 hull but incorporated twin diesel engines, the M36B2. 3 different chassis, 1 gun. Total production across all variants reached roughly 2,300 vehicles. The first 600 were shipped without muzzle brakes. Crews firing the 90mm in combat were effectively blinding themselves with every shot. The massive concussive blast obscured the gunner's sight picture and disrupted follow-up shots. Rate of fire suffered until a double baffle muzzle brake was hastily fitted beginning in November. By December 20th, 1944, 4 days into the German Ardennes Offensive, only 236 M36 were in combat across the entire European theater, a few hundred vehicles. They became the backbone of American anti-armor defense during the worst crisis of the Western Front. At Monschau, amid the desperate scramble to halt the leading German spearheads, Staff Sergeant Charlie Lupo drew an M36 straight from a repair depot at Brimont. Neither he nor his gunner, Corporal William Beckman, had ever operated one before. They figured out how to start it. They drove it into position. Beckman fired 3 90mm rounds into a Panther until it burned. For men who had spent months fighting at distances where survival required luck, the M36 offered something new: reach. 2 men. A vehicle they had never operated. A Panther destroyed in their first engagement. The gun was that good. The defense of St. Vith proved what 236 open-topped tank destroyers could accomplish when nothing else stood between a panzer army and open road. M36S from the 814th Tank Destroyer Battalion, Lieutenant Rose's own unit, formed the direct-fire backbone of the American line for 6 days. When German armored thrusts slammed into the perimeter, the 90mm guns shattered them. When pressure temporarily eased, Sherman companies counterattacked to regain lost ground. The German timetable demanded St. Vith by 6 p.m. on December 17th. It did not fall until December 21st. After the war, General Hasso von Manteuffel, commander of the 5th Panzer Army, stated that the stubborn defense convinced him he was facing an entire corps. He was not. He had been stopped by a thin screen of infantry, a limited number of Shermans, and a line of relentless tank destroyers whose 90mm guns were the only American weapons in that sector capable of defeating what he had committed. Elsewhere on the northern shoulder of the Bulge, the 702nd Tank Destroyer Battalion provided the clearest statistical proof of the 90mm's superiority. 3 battalions of Shermans from the 67th Armored Regiment destroyed 5 Panthers. The M36 equipped 702nd destroyed 15, 3 times the kill rate, with fewer vehicles. And it was in that same region, with the 814th, that Lieutenant Rose fired at the last number on his sight. 4,600 yards, 2.5 miles. His first 2 shots were ranging rounds. The third struck the Panther. He continued firing armor-piercing and high-explosive shells until the target burned. At that distance, each round traveled roughly 5 to 6 seconds before impact. The Panther on the ridge would have appeared no larger than a thumbnail held at arm's length. Modern tanks equipped with laser rangefinders and computerized fire control systems struggle to achieve first-round hits at such distances. Rose did it with a 5-power optical sight, manual calculations, and a reticle that simply ended at the number he needed. Ballistics explained part of what happened. At close range, around 150 yards, a Panther's sloped glacis could deflect even a 90mm round if the angle of impact favored the armor. At 4,600 yards, however, the projectile descended steeply, striking thinner, more vulnerable surfaces. The protective geometry of the slope no longer worked in the defender's favor. At maximum range, the tank was in some ways more vulnerable than it would have been at point-blank distance. But the M36's greatest advantage carried its most dangerous weakness. The open turret that gave commanders unmatched visibility also gave the enemy a direct path into the fighting compartment. German artillery crews adapted quickly. Their preferred tactic was to call for airbursts directly above American tank destroyers. Shells detonated mid-air, sending shrapnel downward into the exposed turret. Nothing short of a fully armored roof could stop it. Snipers targeted exposed commanders, and in the winter of 1944, the cold itself became a weapon. Crews fought for hours inside open steel turrets in temperatures capable of freezing exposed skin in minutes. They improvised. Andrew Phillips of the 703rd Tank Destroyer Battalion had been a skilled welder before the war. He cut 3-inch steel plates and welded them to the angled front surfaces of his vehicle. Then he did the same for every tank destroyer in his unit he could reach. Other crews stretched canvas and shelter halves across the turret opening to deflect grenades, fabric against explosives. They stacked sandbags along the hull, strapped spare track links to vulnerable surfaces, and fabricated improvised turret roofs from scrap steel. The Army eventually developed an official folding armored roof kit. It was standardized in August 1945. Germany had surrendered 3 months earlier. Every field modification added weight, reduced mobility, and contradicted the doctrine that had left the turret open in the first place. Every sandbag and welded plate was a quiet admission that the battlefield had not unfolded according to theory. The men inside the M36 were proving 2 things at once. They were proving the doctrine wrong, and they were proving that the gun inside that turret was worth protecting at any cost. The open turret reflected a world in which tank destroyers ambushed from concealment and withdrew before the enemy could react. The welded scrap reflected the world they actually inhabited, one where they stood and fought like tanks they were never meant to be. In doing so, the M36 answered a question the Army had avoided for 3 years. If the 90mm gun performed this well in a thin-skinned vehicle with no roof, what would it do in a fully armored tank? The answer arrived in February 1945, when the M26 Pershing entered combat carrying the same 90mm M3 gun. That caliber would remain the standard American tank armament for the next 15 years. The tank destroyer doctrine had been built around specialization. The M36 proved that firepower, not theory, decided survival. The M46 Patton, the M47, the M48. Every major American tank built between 1945 and 1960 traced its primary armament directly to the gun that sat in the open turret of the M36. In 1945, the General Board reviewed the war's lessons and delivered a conclusion that was both simple and devastating. Now that tanks themselves could carry the 90mm gun, there was no justification for a separate, lightly armored force built solely to mount it. The logic was blunt. If a medium tank can carry the same weapon, there is no reason to build a different vehicle to carry it for them. The Tank Destroyer Center at Fort Hood closed on November 10, 1945. The final assessment stated plainly, there was no longer a functional difference between a tank destroyer and a medium tank. Put the big gun on the tank. The M36 had proven the concept so effectively that the concept itself no longer required a separate branch. The weapon killed its own institution, but the vehicle refused to disappear. In the 1950s, Yugoslavia received 399 M36. They kept them operational for half a century. Yugoslav engineers removed the original Ford gasoline engines and installed Soviet diesel power plants, cutting through the firewall to make them fit. They added infrared night vision equipment. They issued modern ammunition capable of penetrating 300 millimeters of armor. When Yugoslavia fractured in 1991, the M36 went to war again. Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia, Kosovo. During NATO's 1999 air campaign, Serbian crews used M36s as decoys, deliberately exposing them to draw precision-guided munitions away from modern equipment. A 1944 design deceiving 1990s technology. The last operational M36 was retired in 2004, 60 years after the first rolled out of the Fisher Tank Arsenal in Michigan. It outlived the branch that created it. It outlived the doctrine that justified it. It even outlived the country that adopted it in its final service. Today, surviving M36s stand in museums from Fort Moore, Georgia, to Seoul, South Korea. One sits at the American Heritage Museum in Massachusetts, where visitors can ride inside for $195, seated in the same open turret that once gave Lieutenant Rose a clear line of sight to the final marking on his reticle. On Kinmen Island in Taiwan, 2 remain in their original combat fortifications, still aimed across the strait toward mainland China. Somewhere in the mathematics of ballistics, one fact remains. On December 1, 1944, a lieutenant looked through a telescopic sight at the last number engraved on the glass. 4,600 yards, 2.5 miles, a target the size of a thumbnail. He fired into 5 seconds of silence, and something impossible burned on a German ridge. That was the M36, open-topped, thin-skinned, built on 3 different hulls because one was not enough, rushed to the front 2 years late, and the only weapon in the American arsenal capable of reaching to the outer limit of what optics could measure and destroying what nothing else could touch. The engineers left a hole where the roof should have been. The crews gave it a war, the gun gave it everything else. If you found this story worth your time, support the mission behind Battalica. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share the video with someone who values military history told without distortion. It helps more than you think. And if you have perspective on the M36, doctrine versus firepower, protection versus visibility, leave it in the comments. The best discussions often come from veterans, engineers, and serious students of armor. Thank you for watching.